The following program is brought to you by the Internet Broadcasting Organization. Nothing stated by Steve Bartlett during the Fight Back with Steve show is intended to be legal advice, and appearing on the show does not create an attorney-client relationship with Steve Bartlett. Before taking legal action, it is advisable to consult with an attorney of your choice. The views and opinions expressed by the callers and guests of the Fight Back with Steve show are solely opinionated by those individuals and are not necessarily the expressions and viewpoints of Steve Bartlett or Talkwat Studios.
It's Monday night, 9 o'clock. You know what time that is. It's time for Fight Back with Steve Bartlett. Hi, I'm your host, Steve Bartlett, and welcome to my show. Now, you're probably wondering, that can't be Steve. He's not wearing his suit. He always wears a suit, except for when he wears tie-dye, but where's his suit today? Well, let me tell you. You know what I wore this morning when I went to work? A suit. You know what I wore Friday all day at the office? A suit. The day before that? A suit. A day before that, a suit. Every day I have to wear a suit to court, even though I live in Florida, which means I have to park in a parking lot about a mile away from the courthouse and schlep with files when it's 90-degree weather, wearing a coat. And then when I get into the courthouse, I have to stay in there for a couple hours, and the government, trying to save money, always has that air conditioning at a nice cozy 80 degrees or so in the courthouse. So there I am, wearing a suit, wearing a coat, where it's 80 degrees without any ventilation in the courthouse, and I sweat like Nixon trying to keep a secret from his grandmother while I'm in the courthouse every day. So I got but I have to do that. Why? Because judges say that lawyers have to wear suits when they go to court. But you know what? This is my show. This is my kingdom. I can do what I want. So if I don't want to wear a suit tonight, I'm not going to wear a suit. I can dress however I want. Doesn't matter how I look. What matters is what I say. It doesn't matter what my appearance is. What matters is how I think. As Martin Luther King famously said, a person should not be, judged on the color of his skin, but on his character. And that's how people should be judged, not based upon appearances. Because everyone is equal. Everyone is equal in the eyes of God. Everyone is equal in the eyes of the law. Unfortunately, it hasn't always been that way. When the Constitution was originally ratified, equality of its citizens only was legal when it dealt with the relationship with the citizens and the federal government. States could legally discriminate against individuals for any reason they wanted: sex, race, age, religious belief. There were no state rights of equal protection under the law. There was only a federal right of equal protection under the law. However, the Civil War changed that. And after the North beat the South in the Civil War, one of the most important moments of American history took place. And that was in 1868, when the 14th Amendment of the Constitution was passed under Lincoln. It was huge. No, actually, Lincoln wasn't president. He had already passed away. But this was Lincoln's baby, the 14th Amendment. But when it passed, what the 14th Amendment said in part was that no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the law. And what this law did was say that within states, people have equal protection as well. And therefore, no state entity can illegally discriminate against a person due to any reason. All men are created equal, and that goes in the states as well. Now later in the 60s, that applied, equal protection applied to businesses when trying to get a job. you can't be discriminated because of race due to civil rights legislation as well. So this was when individuals had to not discriminate. But the basic ideas under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment deals with the state government not being able to discriminate based upon race. And as everyone knows, race has been the historical bastard of the United States. The questions of racism is America's dark history, our dark secret, the worst part of ourselves. Even though America has accomplished a lot, the worst thing is our history of race in this country. To our credit, the United States is a better country than it was in the 1800s when slavery was legal, and better than we were in the early parts of the 20th century under Jim Crow. And we're no longer in the 1960s where people were legally able to be discriminated against, with separate but equal being overturned by Brown versus the Board of Education. So things have progressed. And in 1961, President Kennedy, who was one of many presidents who were trying to help advance African Americans in our country who had a long history of discrimination. He came out with an executive order in 1961, Executive Order 10925, I think is what it was. And no one knows what this executive order was for anymore. Nobody knows why it's that number or anything like that. But it's of historical importance because there's a phrase in this executive order that Kennedy came up with in a way to try to battle against racism and discrimination. And what that executive order says is that it established a concept by saying that the federal government would use funds to take affirmative action to ensure that hiring and employment practices are free of racial bias. The term affirmative action was first used in this executive order by John Kennedy. It's the first time anyone had ever used this expression. Okay? Now, what is affirmative action? People hear the term affirmative action, and what affirmative action are steps taken by the government to try to help minorities who have a history of being discriminated against be able to eventually reach equality. The whole idea is we can't just go immediately from Jim Crow to a society in which we say, okay, everyone's equal right now, when a large percentage of the African Americans in our country do not have the same standard of living, do not have the same level of education, do not have the same level of wealth as white America does. So the idea was to give certain advantages to minority people in order to help alleviate some of the pains that were left over from slavery and by Jim Crow. And the one way that actually occurred more than any other way is in the area of education. And what happened was, in the concept of affirmative action, was that the government would, through colleges, state universities, would try to give preferences to make sure that minorities weren't underrepresented in colleges. So even though African Americans might not do as well on testing or have the same GPA as other applicants, they wanted to ensure that all the people who went to a college weren't white. And so they used this thing called affirmative action to try to allow minorities to get an education. And they argued that African Americans were not able to get the same grades or test scores due to remnants of racism. Even though they might be qualified in other areas, they were not as qualified as whites because of the fact that whites had advantages that a lot of African Americans didn't have. So therefore, the government would use affirmative action to try to help rise the black person up to a higher standard of living. Okay? Now, that's a really great idea. That's a really great concept. It's really noble to try to change our country. But the question is affirmative action legal? Because in order to say that you're going to benefit someone because of race, that's not treating people equally, is it? If people are created equal, and the law under the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, says that everyone is equal under the law, then giving racial preference because someone's a minority and has been historically discriminated against, doesn't that violate the Equal Protection Amendment? And a lot of people were very upset with affirmative action, saying that the white majority were being discriminated against, that they were being affected and not treated equally. They were treated inferiorly because blacks were getting positions in schools, in colleges that whites thought that they were more qualified to get. Now let's see, is affirmative action legal when it appears on its face to be legal discrimination? Well, like I've talked about in other shows, there are no such things as absolute rights. Like freedom of speech is not an absolute right. You can't yell fire in a burning building because you can cause people being trampled. So there are limits. You can't slander someone. That's a limit on freedom of speech. And the test and that's how all your rights are. There are no absolute rights. People say you have a right to life. Well, if you kill someone, you can be executed. That people have a right to privacy, yes, they have a right to privacy, but if there's probable cause, the police can get a warrant and come into your house. So the test for once you have a fundamental right, and the right to be treated equal under the law is a fundamental right, the government can violate that right if there's a compelling interest to do so. If there's a compelling interest, then the government can violate a right. So they have to have a really, really good reason before they can violate a right, okay? So what happened was there was a case at the University of California back in the 70s called Bakke, University of California versus Bakke, okay? And the university actually looked at college applicants and decided that they would give some racial preferences to minorities. And the reason why they were doing that, according to the school, was because they considered diversity to be an important part of a good education. And they didn't want all of their students to look exactly the same. They didn't want a student body of all 100% white male students. They wanted people from different backgrounds. They thought that the best education could be if there were people from all different cultures, colors, and creeds going to the university. And the Supreme Court said, you know what? Promoting diversity is a compelling reason to violate the equal protection laws in our country. And because of that, because the goal of diversity is a compelling reason, the government can legally discriminate against a sector of people, and affirmative action is therefore legal. Okay? That's what Bakke actually determined. Okay? Now, what happened in Bakke was that they actually had these quotas in which they said, we're going to hold 16 out of 100 seats for black students. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's illegal. Having a quota system, saying you're going to have a quota and say that specific seats are going to be reserved just because of the color of your skin, that's not about diversity. Diversity is looking at a broad range of things and then judging individuals one by one and then looking at that. That's promoting diversity, but quota systems are unconstitutional. Okay? But the whole concept of affirmative action was upheld by Bakke. Okay? Now let's jump down, okay? Let's jump down to the 2000s, okay? After 20 years of precedent or 30 years of precedent after Bakke of affirmative action, the state of Michigan went crazy, okay? For some reason, I don't know why, but the state of Michigan is obsessed with affirmative action. There's been 3 landmark cases that have occurred since 2003 dealing with the state of Michigan, and Michigan has the University of Michigan has been in the center of each one of these controversial cases. The first case was a case called Gratz versus Bottlinger back in 2003. And what this university did was they looked at a lot of factors to decide, who's going to be going to the university. They would look at factors besides, they would look at GPA and put points, and you get a certain amount of points for having a 4.0 GPA. And then they give you a certain amount of points for your SAT scores. And then they would give you a certain amount of points for if you came from a poor neighborhood versus an affluent neighborhood. And they gave you a certain amount of points for this and that. But they also gave an amount of points that if you were a minority, you were given 20 points automatically for being able to get accepted into that school. And so what happened is the Supreme Court struck that down as unconstitutional because it was wrong to automatically give somebody 20 points for being black or being a minority, according to the Supreme Court, that you could consider to be a factor. You can look at a person's entire history and say, yes, the person comes from a poor background, the person is African American, the person has a certain amount of scores, and treat it subjectively. But when you objectively quantify it by saying you get a certain amount of points, the Supreme Court had a problem with that and said that's basically the same thing as having a quota, which Bakke declared was unconstitutional. Okay? Now, there was a case called Grutter. Now, in Grutter, another 2003 case. So when Michigan was told you can't do what you're doing, they changed the rules a little bit and said, okay, well, let's change the rules in how we do applicants now. We'll get rid of that point counting system, and what we'll do instead is we will say that we're going to look at a lot of other factors besides grades and SAT scores in determining who's going to be going to our college. And race can be one of those factors, but we're not going to give any points. We'll just look at each applicant as an individual and look at a person's entire background, and with the idea that we want cultural diversity. Supreme Court said that was legal, that since they got rid of the points, this new system that they did under Grutter in the same year was constitutional because affirmative action and the idea of diversity is a good thing. So therefore, they can consider race, but they can't put a point number for that. Now, at the time, it was a very controversial decision. It was a 5-4 decision, and the judges Kennedy, Scalia, and Thomas dissented. Now, that's important. I'll get to that in a second. Because just last week, there was a new Supreme Court case that came down that's all over the news called Chouette versus Coalition to Defend Affirmative Action. And what happened in this case is, once again, what state did it take care of? Michigan, right? So this happened in Michigan again, but this is a little bit different, okay? So as we said, in 2003, at first Michigan said, we're going to give point systems to minorities. Supreme Court killed it. Then they said, well, we're going to get rid of the point system, but we'll look at a person's entire background, including SAT scores, grades, but also people's backgrounds. Did they work when they were in high school? Were they affluent? What color is their skin? It's just one of the many features that makes a person who they are. Supreme Court said that was fine, except for the dissenting members who I just talked about a couple seconds ago. Okay? But then the voters in Michigan decided, we don't like affirmative action at all. We don't like affirmative action. Affirmative action to us is reverse racism. So they actually put on a referendum on the ballot during the election to make it illegal for the state of Michigan to engage in affirmative action or to even consider race at all as a factor when deciding who its applicants would be at the university. Okay? Now, that was challenged as being unconstitutional, and that law passed. The law is now in Michigan saying that they cannot use affirmative action at the University of Michigan. They can't do it. Affirmative action is now illegal based upon the change in the Constitution of the state of Michigan. And people went to the Supreme Court on that, and the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution of Michigan, which prohibits affirmative action, is constitutional. Now, the liberals, who I normally totally agree with on the Supreme Court, went crazy and were upset and said that it's a big blow to Americans who are against racism in our country. But for once, I think the Supreme Court got it right. And here's why. Affirmative action isn't something that's protected by the Constitution. What the Constitution protects is equal protection under the law. The exception to that is affirmative action. If there's a compelling state interest, we can make an exception to your rights. So you have rights to equal protection. There's a compelling state interest of providing diversity, and therefore we can have an exception by using affirmative action to try to get diversity on campus. Okay? It's not mandatory. Affirmative action is not mandatory under the Constitution. It's only allowable under certain circumstances under the Constitution. To say that it's unconstitutional to take away an exception to a challenge to the constitutionality of something is really absurd. It's like, for instance, let's take freedom of speech. The government is not allowed to ban speech unless they have a compelling state interest. So let's say it's you make a bomb threat. A bomb threat is against the law. The government has a compelling state interest to say you're not allowed to make bomb threats. But let's say the government decides to change their minds and say, you know what, it's no longer against the law to make bomb threats. You can make bomb threats. You can't then say, well, that's a violation of freedom of speech. Okay? Saying it's no longer illegal to make bomb threats is not a violation of freedom of speech any more than saying that affirmative action is no longer going to be allowed is not a violation of the equal protection. Affirmative action is an allowable exception to the equal protection under the law, but it's not required. You don't have to require affirmative action, okay? So a state can decide they don't want affirmative action if they want to. Now, my opinion, I think that eventually the Supreme Court is going to overturn affirmative action completely because the three dissenters on the last case that upheld affirmative action are all in the Supreme Court now. Yeah, we got a caller. What do you think? Do you think affirmative action is going to be overturned?
I think this subject is moot. When I watch a college basketball game, I think that there's plenty of equality. And when I watch a football game, a college football game, college basketball game, there's no inequality on those teams.
So because you watch sports, there's no inequality. I don't understand what you're saying.
Well, isn't this all about race? This is all about race, the minorities. That's what this is all about. And I think that there's plenty of minorities in the colleges, and it's easy to prove that because of the number of minorities on the basketball team and the football team.
Well, first of all, a reason why there are minorities going to school is a lot of students have taken advantage of affirmative action in order to get into college.
Right.
And second of all, you can't take
They're playing football. So what's the big deal?
Well, there's 11 people on a football team and 5 people on a basketball team, and when you have a campus the size of Florida State with 40,000 students saying, well, you have 5 black people in the basketball team, that really isn't indicative of the whole student population.
Well, aren't they a showcase for the school? Aren't the basketball, the sports teams like a showcase for the school? Everybody wants them to win. Everybody's behind the teams. I just don't understand what the big deal is about affirmative action. And there's equality for all minorities, and it's easy to tell that because, like I said, when you're watching a basketball game or a football game, there's plenty of minorities represented in those sports.
The other problem with that is
I just think there's a bunch of bull hockey, that's all.
So, the only qualification that should be done, so you believe in affirmative action if the person who's going to college can dunk a basketball or throw a football down the field. But if someone wants to be a doctor or a lawyer and they don't have athletic ability, well, then they shouldn't be able to go to college because they grew up in a neighborhood which is poor, they grew up disadvantaged, so therefore, screw them.
They should learn a skill. They should learn a skill like basketball or football. That way they can get into college. What's so hard to figure out?
Okay. Well, how do you think colleges should decide who gets to go there and who doesn't get to go there?
The best players on the team should get in.
Okay. forget the sports teams, just for regular students. There's other students in college who don't play sports. I don't know if you're aware of that or not.
Well, when I see them on TV, they're playing on a football team.
Okay.
Or basketball.
I'm
sure you watch the.
What qualifications? What qualifications?
It's very, very clear that the minorities are represented in all those colleges and in all those teams.
What qualifications should allow a person to go to a university or not?
I've already answered that. It's
okay, let me reverse it.
How good of an athlete, or student athlete they are.
Okay, so only student athletes should go to college? That's it?
No.
Okay.
Other people can go to college, but why is there this big to-do about affirmative action when, again, when you watch them on TV, there's a large percentage of minorities.
Okay, let me put it this way. If you were a university admissions department and you had two applications in front of you, and both of the applications were applicants who had good grades and had good SAT scores, but the one applicant was bored very rich, had a private tutor, and the other applicant was poor and had to work a full-time job while they were in school and had to take care of their younger brother and sister because their mother was in prison for being a crack addict. But they got almost identical grades. But the one person who had the full-time job, who went to the worst school, who had to take a bus to school each way for 3 hours, and had all those other hurdles, who would you want to go to the school? Who would you pick?
Obviously, that's simple. The one whose father gave the most money for the endowment for the college.
Well,
you'd want to reward that by letting his son or daughter in. I mean,
that's a problem with the
basketball or football or lacrosse or whatever they choose to play. That's what, if I were the admission director, whoever gave us the most money for our endowment, that's an easy choice.
Well, that's the way it actually does work. If you look at a lot of universities, let's say they did the same thing at a large university, a prestigious university like Harvard or Yale or something like that, and they said that there's not going to be any more affirmative action, that race can no longer be a factor that can be considered by the university, that diversity is no longer something that the university should look towards in order to fill its roster of students. Under that law, the university can still allow legacies to go into the university. People who don't have the same grades, people who don't have the same SAT scores, but are able to go to universities like Yale because of who their father is. George W. Bush was able to go to Yale even though he's a mental midget. He's a mental midget, and the real problem isn't the white guy who can't get into Yale because a black guy took his spot. The real problem is an idiot like George W. Bush gets to go to Yale while a poor white guy and a poor black guy can't get into Yale. At least affirmative action tries to level the playing field. And here's the deal.
I don't understand. When I watched Yale football, George W. Bush was on the sidelines as a cheerleader. What's the problem? So if some a minority wanted to play football, he would get on the team. Very simple.
Okay, who is this calling anyway? What's your name?
This is the Walrus.
I thought it was the Walrus. It's
your liberal rants are just highly amusing and a bit.
Hey, I took up for the Supreme Court. I took up for the Supreme Court today. In the Schuett case that decided 2 weeks ago, the liberals are all up in arms. I'm saying they decided it correct. I agree there is no constitutional right to affirmative action. I agree with affirmative action. I think it should be, I think that's what we should encourage our leaders to pass laws allowing for affirmative action, but it is not mandatory under the Constitution. Okay, so thanks for calling. I really appreciate it, Mr. Walrus. I thought it was a very Walrusian call. I should have known it was you. Thanks for calling, and hopefully you'll call back next week. But I'd like to thank all the people who watched today. Hopefully you learned a little bit about the Equal Protection Clause, a little bit about affirmative action. And as I tell everyone right now, if you're facing injustice, if you don't like the way things are going, there's three ways to react. One way is to roll over and just go with whatever the majority says and just go with the flow. The second way is you can put your head in the sand and ignore the problem. Or the third thing you can do is you can do your best to fight back. You might not always win, but hey, sometimes it's worth the fight. So thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
This program was brought to you by the Internet Broadcasting Organization, setting the standard for new media broadcasting.